Perfect Union and KC Tenants put out this video about tenant organizing currently going on in the country. Let's take a look from that clip from More Perfect Union.
Over a third of Americans are renters, and if you're in that category, you probably don't need to be told that the rental market is out of control. The question is, can anything actually be done about it? A historic wave of tenant organizing, unlike anything we've seen in decades, has found one answer: national rent control.
The tenant movement is absolutely within striking distance of rent regulation at the national level.
But it's not just tenants who are organized. This is also a story about how some of America's biggest landlords, banks, and private equity firms are hiding behind innocent-sounding front groups, all while pooling their money to keep your rent high. The current surge in tenant organizing is the most significant since the 1970s. And it's allowing renters to fight for the kind of big relief that only the federal government can enact. For private equity firms like Blackstone, membership in lobbying groups is a way to protect their profits against threats like the current push for rent control.
A More Perfect Union tweeted this week, "National rent control is closer than you think. A historic wave of tenant organizing is on the verge of winning renter protections that would be attached to federal loans, affecting 1 in 4 apartments. But Greystar, Blackstone, and Avalon Bay are spending millions to block it." Director of KC Tenants Tara Raghuveer joins us now to discuss. Tara, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So give us a status update on these protests that are taking place and the potential for these rent controls to be enacted.
Yeah, so we are a few days out from the end of a comment period that the Federal Housing Finance Agency has opened responding to tenant organizing for the majority of the last 2 years. Tenants have pushed this agency to consider the ways that they need to use federally backed financing as leverage to hold the market accountable to protecting tenants. And they've invited these comments from the industry. They've invited comments from tenants. We're closing in on 2,000 comments from tenants in federally backed homes across the country. And the comment period closes on Monday. So after that, we have a few months to see what the FHFA will go on to do. And we are very optimistic that they will consider regulating our rents and also protecting tenants from evictions, bad conditions in some of these units that are financed by federally backed loans.
So the latest estimate I have here of what median rent is in the country is $2,029. Now, I would say the rent is too damn high. A lot of people would say the rent is too damn high. Can you say some more about the commodification of housing and how we got into this situation where landlords have continued to raise rent and now it's so high that people are just one accident away from losing their homes?
The rent is too damn high. It's a catastrophe, and it's one that's been enabled by the federal government. To the extent that the federal government has made any significant play in promoting housing supply, it's been through federally backed loans. But those loans have not come with any regulation. So landlords like Blackstone, like the CIM group, they get loans on lucrative terms. They go and acquire properties. They rent those properties out to tenants. But then those are also some of the same actors that hike rents in the most aggressive ways and also evict with no regard for the tenant's stability or the tenant's lives. The federal government has basically allowed this to exist, and the market remains vastly unregulated.
So I'm in agreement, I think, generally that there should be less corporate ownership of private housing, and particularly there should be fewer corporate landlords. But most economists say that rent control is actually damaging to the housing market because it ultimately reduces supply. A Stanford study from 2019 of the San Francisco housing market found that while rent control helped current renters temporarily, it ended up increasing prices for future renters and also increased the gentrification in the areas where the rent control was enacted. So what is your response to that common criticism from economists?
The common criticism from economists, and many of those economists are in bed with the profiteers who benefit from opposing the idea that rent control is good. Landlords are doing what we would consider rent gouging now. There was just a report out yesterday from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about rent inflation that identified this vast issue around rent gouging. And what I would say is this, it relates to what I was saying to Jessica. The federal government has already made a significant play on the supply side, and that's been through promoting liquidity in the secondary mortgage market through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans. The problem is, if we don't regulate that market that the federal government already has a stake in, we're hemorrhaging affordable housing supply at a rate that way outpaces our ability to produce new supply. And that preservation of supply is critically important at a time like this when the rent is too damn high.
So you said, we're in striking distance of rent control. Is a rent strike, you think, on the table when it comes to tenants organizing for lower rents? What do you think it's going to take organizing-wise to get landlords to the point where we do have rent control or we have reasonable rent in the country? Or is it going to be that we have to, force this upon the federal government through good organizing?
I think it's a combination of all of these things. We're organizing with tenant unions across the country. We've had dozens of tenant unions spring up just this summer as we've been organizing in federally backed properties. We've knocked tens of thousands of doors in those properties and pushed those tenants to submit comments, not just submit comments to FHFA, but also start meeting with their neighbors and really taking seriously the organizing potential of the tenant union. So I do think we're within striking distance of federal rent control, and we're not naive about what it's going to take us to actually get there. And ultimately, it might take a real disruption of the flow of capital to the profiteers who own our homes. And that might look like a rent strike. I think that's not something that's necessarily on the table today. We don't necessarily have the power to pull that off in the tenant movement, but it's certainly something that we're building the power to be able to execute when the moment calls for it.
Are there other policies besides rent control that your organization is looking at, perhaps, for example, direct subsidies to current low-income renters?
We're looking at other policies like eviction protections. Good cause eviction is something that we want to see as part of these eviction protections that we're asking of the FHFA. We're also looking at policies like social housing. The Homes Guarantee Campaign has been a leading proponent of social housing at the federal level since 2019. We're looking at tens of millions of units of social housing that we need across this country in order to disrupt the current nature of the market, where these corporate landlords have consolidated the market such that they can price set and hold us all hostage to their demands.
I think there's like an unfortunate narrative, I would say, in the country right now around homelessness, right? People losing their houses. You're very close to this. You see a lot of this every day, people dealing with eviction. I think there's an unnecessary sort of pejorative framing of homelessness, that there are always people who are criminals, who are using drugs, et cetera. Can you just say more about how close the average working person in America is to losing their homes and, just how you see folks that you organize with facing eviction?
There's no county in this country where a two-bedroom apartment is affordable to a worker who's working full-time, meaning most of us are paying over 30%, many of us paying over 50% of our incomes for the places that we live. That also means that one emergency, as you said before, a flat tire, a sick kid, is all that separates us from the precarity of eviction and the potential of homelessness. This is much, much closer to all of us than any of us really consider, I think, on a day-to-day basis. And you're right to say, I think there's a narrative that has a chokehold on our media, on our elected officials sometimes, around what homelessness means and who becomes homeless. The truth is that so many people are on the brink of homelessness or are living homeless today, couch surfing in hotels, in short-term rentals, because they can't make anything else work. And we have to acknowledge the kind of much larger, more nuanced story about homelessness that exists in the economy as it looks today.
Thanks for joining us, Tara. We'll be back with more Rising after this.